Good morning, everybody, and welcome to what I think is one of the most important panel discussions of this FT event. Because we have been talking a lot about the shock created by the crisis. We've been talking about ways to survive and to recover. But as we look to the future, and we need to look to the future, the question is not simply how do we recover, how do we rebuild, but also, I would argue, how do we build back better? Because we don't want to just recreate the system we had before, and frankly, we probably couldn't anyway. So the question about what kind of world we're trying to create, what role companies will be playing in that respect, what role investors have to play, and how that interacts with the government is particularly crucial. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by a fantastic panel of people who can talk about this. I should start by saying, by the way, we are very grateful for the support for this panel from both the High Meadows Institute and Hansen Young. But we have, talking about these themes, Paul Polman, who is a veritable luminary in the world of environmental, social and governance issues, ESG, and sustainability. He was previously running Unilever, but is now very much working with a range of companies to try and reorientate the corporate sector. We have Allison Young, who's coming to us from Hansen Young, where she's been also looking at these issues in great detail. We have Tansy Whelan, who is in many ways a pretty rare creature because she spent part of her life working as an environmental activist with groups like the Rainforest Alliance, but is now at the NYU Stern Business School teaching the next generation of corporate leaders how to embrace some of the issues she once campaigned over. And we have Chris Pinney from the High Meadows Institute in Boston, which has been championing the idea that business needs to reorientate itself even before COVID-19. So a terrific panel. I should also say, by the way, that if any of you watching are interested in these themes, do check out our More on Money platform and newsletter, because we're covering this day in, day out, and we have a lot of material to write about right now. But let me start with you, Chris Pinney, because yesterday, Michael O'Leary from Ryanair was part of this webinar, and he said very explicitly that he thought that in the coming years, environmental issues would not be so important because everyone would be focused on growth. That's a point that I've heard from quite a few people who've been saying, well, ESG was great during a bull market, but it's turned into something of a luxury good that we just can't afford these days, to cite a comment made by MSCI. Chris, would you agree?
Well, clearly I wouldn't. He also, I think, was the fellow who said that Zoom meetings were crap. So he's lost on both counts, in my opinion. I think what we're going to find is, in fact, if anything, ESG is going to be strengthened, and all signs point that it is being strengthened through this crisis. Most interestingly, to put it in market terms, the ESG indexes and stocks are certainly significantly outperforming their peers in the stock market because they've gone into this crisis with more stability, more trust, more capability. At the same time, we've seen the fastest growing segment of the market for new funds pouring into them are ESG funds. So, I mean, just to speak strictly to it from a market perspective, the market is speaking and ESG is here to stay. At a corporate level, I work with a number of large companies and a number of large institutional investors. And what's interesting, the Aspen Business and Society program brings together a group of leading sustainability officers from the major global firms. And we had a meeting not too long ago in which the obvious question is, well, is the staff being cut, or is ESG being pushed to the back burner? And the response was completely the reverse. While others are being laid off, ESG teams are being kept intact and in some cases strengthened. ESG teams are being brought into the executive management level to discuss how to manage through this crisis. And we're seeing the same thing on the investment side. Investment teams, while a lot of day traders are being laid off, the ESG teams, stewardship teams continue to be strengthened. So strictly from a market perspective, all the indicators are that ESG is not only surviving this, but is being in some way strengthened by what this crisis brings to mind. And clearly what this crisis does, and the cliche is don't let a good crisis go to waste, is it creates an opportunity to really focus on the systemic challenges that we now face and that business now has to step up to, as well as governments. And Paul will be very eloquent on this, and certainly the work he did at Unilever is an exemplar of that.
Right.
Essentially, we're going for a moment of, and I think Paul's successor, Alan Jope, said, you know, we've gone through a period of seductive incrementalism where we've changed things on the periphery and we thought that was sufficient and we've been able to make a market out of that. We now have to move it to the core of business strategy and business practices. And that's the process that I think that this crisis is going to stimulate.
Right. Well, I'm going to turn to Paul in a moment because I know you have some great stories to tell, Paul, in a second. But before I do, I'd like to bring in Allison because your job title is chair of the Global Accounts Committee, which doesn't have the word sustainability in it at Hansen Young. Hansen Young isn't a special activist group by any stretch of the imagination. So tell us, from the point of view of a mainstream company, from the point of view of someone holding a mainstream role within that company, how do you see this playing out?
Thanks, Gillian. So, you know, from our perspective, we care very, very deeply about ESG, and, you know, our purpose starts with building a better working world. And so it's the heart of who we stand for, but we're also looking at our clients and the market more broadly to see, you know, what really matters in this crisis. And we've put a lot of research and focus on this. And I would say that it is an enduring theme. ESG is an enduring theme, particularly for organisations who really put purpose, long-term value, environmental concerns at the heart of who they are and what they stand for. And I think from our perspective, you know, the companies that are outperforming still in the market are the ones who are putting ESG at the heart of who they are, even during the crisis. I think it's also fair to say that public scrutiny has never been higher for businesses overall. And those businesses that will have the trust of the public through this crisis are the ones that continue to drive that agenda around ESG and don't put it on the back burner. They're the ones who, you know, treat their people in the right way. They're the ones who really continue to care for the environment. They're the ones who do the right things for society. And I think it's my view that, you know, there are a lot of companies out there who are doing this well and who continue, even during this crisis, to put this at the heart of who they are and what they stand for.
Right. Tansy, would you agree? I mean, are you seeing, I mean, heaven knows what's going to happen to business schools in the future, but are you seeing business school students suddenly saying, you know what, I need to get a job, I need to pay the bills, I can't afford to worry about this stuff anymore?
Well, I think what we're seeing, and this goes to the point about, you know, why are companies with ESG credentials performing better? What we're seeing is that sustainability and ESG is really just at its base, good management, right? And so if you want to move forward as a company, build back better, you want to build back better with good management practices in place. So as an example, why are companies performing better now, have good ESG? They, for example, understand and know their supply chains because they had to understand them from an environmental and social perspective before. So now they're more capable of understanding where the challenges and risks are and creating partnerships with those suppliers who are vulnerable and and less resilient at this point in time. We also have seen through our research with companies ranging from you know, pharmaceutical companies to big food companies like Cargill and Mars and others, that indeed investing in sustainability increases innovation, increases operational efficiency, it increases talent retention, et cetera, and reduces risk, right? It creates more resiliency. So I think we're going to see moving forward, both students and business leaders begin to understand that these are not nice to have things, these are must have things, and that actually they translate into bottom line better performance, as well as creating value for society. And finally, I just want to underscore what Allison said about consumers. We've done a lot of research at the Center for Sustainable Business at Stern, working with IRI, which collects barcode data at retail. And what we found is that 50% of the growth in consumer packaged goods came from, over 5 years, the last 5 years, came from sustainability marketed products. And that consumers, even in this crisis, we're seeing are still looking to purchase from companies that align with their values, and they're paying very close attention to what companies are doing right now.
Right. Paul, as a former CEO of Unilever who now runs Imagine, the group that is trying to get other CEOs and executives activated on this, do you see them still caring much about these issues? And how are they doing if they are caring? Because there was a survey that came out recently from Edelman suggesting that trust in business has really collapsed in the last couple of months. So I'm curious, what grade would you give the sector in terms of how they've actually responded? A, B, C, D, or even F?
Yeah, I saw the trust survey from Edelman, and it puts business more or less at par with governments, and that's not a compliment, because I think most of the governments have not done very well. And I would be honest to say that business also is a little bit bifurcated. But in general, the trend to ESG, to more responsible, multi-stakeholder, longer-term business models was already there before the COVID crisis. And I think we have seen a lot of companies that understood the importance of having good relationships with your employees, with your suppliers, responding to the needs of the market and not just being myopically focused on the shareholders, that these companies tended to do better in the crisis, and actually I believe are better placed to come out. That evidence is increasingly there, and Chris and Tansy and Allison have already referred to that. So I think we're going in the right direction, and we might even see an acceleration. But there is a group of businesses that probably prefers the old. You mentioned the company just now, Mr. O'Leary. Just 6 months ago, he was involved in a terrible crisis of his 99 million euros bonus that he got. This is an industry that in the last few years has given 95% of their free cash flow back in share buybacks and special dividends. And now they're going with, hands holding up to the governments for their bailouts. They were the first ones to lay off people. So if we want those type of industries, they were excluded from the Paris Agreement, one of the biggest polluters in climate change and greenhouse gases, which probably is at the origin of this crisis. So there's no doubt that it is an easy thing for many to say, I wish we could go back to where we came from, because it clearly was better for him. But it got us into this problem. In 2006, 2007, when we had the financial crisis and had to spend money to get people out of it, we ended up doing the wrong thing. We didn't spend it behind the environmental things or greening. We spent it for a few people, and we made the income gaps bigger, and it ended up getting us into this crisis to a great extent. So let's not make this mistake again, and design it right to be sure that we can have a better future for everybody. Europe, to some extent, understands that with the European Green Deal, and increasingly the CEOs in Europe are speaking up, also against the airlines, by saying, no, we're not going to lower emission standards on cars. No, we're not going to get you out of commitments you've made. We want you to do this because we want to live in a world that functions for more people and for a longer time period than we've currently been seeing.
Right. Well, I should say, by the way, that if any of you want to ask questions who are watching, whether in Europe or the US or anywhere else, please do use the Q&A function on the screen, and we can use those with Slido to pick out the ones that people are most passionate about, be that about airlines or anything else. But your point, though, Paul, does raise an interesting question. So much of the ESG debate in recent years has been about the E, about climate change. And people like Greta Thunberg have put it on the front pages, and that's been, really top of CEOs' minds, partly because it's been the most tangible one that you can measure and communicate. But we are now seeing more of a focus on S. And that raises a question: how do you define S, and how do you navigate this incredibly complex situation where governments are getting involved in S as well? I mean, Allison, how does a company like Hansen Young look at the S factor? Because, you're not a charity.
No, we're not a charity, but equally, we do believe in long-term value. And, ultimately, profit will come if you focus on the planet. And I think environmental concerns are still at the fore of that. But from an S perspective, I think it is how you treat your people and how you work with society more broadly. Through this crisis, I think the, people who are laying off their staff, people who are, having to furlough staff, there are some companies who absolutely have to do that. But equally, our organisation believes in making sure that we've looked after our people well, that we're making sure that we are, keeping people in employment during this crisis. And equally, I think it is critical for things such as the youth. The youth of today is going to be saddled with a huge debt at the back end of this crisis. They're the ones who are going to have to pay this off. And it saddens me hugely when I see organisations saying to graduates that, you can't, we can't employ you now because of the crisis. I think business have a real moral obligation to be, keeping the graduate entry schemes, to be doing what they can to retain their people, and to really look at, the supply chains and companies that were in the supply chains to support them. So I honestly believe that the S comes in many ways as part of the behaviour of a company if they're looking at long-term value rather than, the indices I'm sure will get there, Gillian, but I actually think it starts now with how a company behaves.
But I mean, because, traditionally when a company thought about how it behaves with the S, it's just looked at philanthropy. It's like, please can I, support, local communities. And that's really valuable. But as you say, I'm curious, Chris or Tansy, and then I'll turn to Paul again, in terms of looking at the S, should companies be, say, rethinking how they treat supply chains? I mean, very struck that a group like L'Oreal, for example, have made a pledge to pay their suppliers quickly. Is that the kind of thing that other companies should be doing? Chris, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Tansy.
So absolutely, I think if companies want to have resilient supply chains long term, they need to move beyond a transactional approach to really more of a partnership approach, which means they need to figure out how they can help these suppliers be more productive long term. It's in their self-interest. When you as a company have a supply chain that is on the edge and where your suppliers are continually challenged from an environmental or social perspective, you create both disruption and volatility in your supply chain, but you also create reputational risk. And we've seen real problems for companies who haven't taken care of those risks and managed for them. I would say as well that the importance of the S, companies have been treating their labor force as externalities over the last 50 years and really focusing more on delivering value to shareholders rather than the rest of the group, and including and especially workers. And what I hope is with this wake-up call, the fact that, for example, in this country, almost half of our workers before the crisis were low-wage workers. That's doubled from about 10, 11 years ago. And those are the workers that are, the most, don't have $400 to weather a crisis. So we need absolutely more leadership on the S without losing the E or the G.
Right, absolutely. Paul, I'm going to turn to you in just a second to ask a bit more about the supply chain, because I know you're working a lot on that. But Chris, how do you see the S playing out? Because quite apart from supply chains, the employee issue is crucial. I mean, you've had such a range of reactions from different companies. I mean, one of them, we were writing about Bird the other day on Moral Money, which sacked a huge number of its staff with a 2-minute Zoom call and relatively few benefits, versus somebody like Airbnb that has also had to lay off a number of people, but given them all company laptops, company equity, health insurance for a year, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see that playing out?
Well, again, to bring it down to sort of the hard numbers, Just Capital has done a good job of tracking the performance of top American companies on these issues, of how they've treated their workforce. And the recent study they've done shows that companies that have good relationships with the workforce have treated their workforce well. Once again, it's an outperformance question. They're outperforming their peers by 7% in terms of equity pricing. But the bigger question is, I think, and there's lots of innovative examples of companies that have done work sharing, partial layoffs, furloughs, creative measures for furloughs. I'm not going to talk about specific companies, because if I talk about one, they're going to wonder why I don't talk about them all. So I won't give you.
Well, you'll get the audience attention that way.
A leading pharmaceutical company, they've been hiring the employees laid off by their customers, bringing them into their supply chain. So there's lots of creative things going on, and groups like Just Capital are doing a good job of tracking that. But the bigger issue on the supply chain, and I heard your colleague from the ILO speaking yesterday, that says basically we're looking at a 50% global poverty rate coming out of this. As to Paul's point of all the people being laid off in textile factories, et cetera. And the question of the supply chain is, the need for more collective action. There's a collective action problem generally in the context of corporate responsibility, but it's just specifically in the supply chain. It's a real issue because you need all of the key manufacturers to band together, to come together, to agree on a set of fair labor practices, so you don't have a beggar thy neighbor situation in the supply chain. And I'm sure Paul can talk to that. He's been part of some of those initiatives, but that's part of the challenge that we need to face.
Yeah, Paul, I mean, you're not usually shy about naming names. Can you give us any great examples or bad examples of handling these S issues?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say climate change is, although it falls under the E from environmental, it's actually an S issue. Climate change is there. We're not fighting climate change for the sake of climate change. We're fighting it because poor people suffer disproportionately, because we're creating worlds where the haves are protected, living on islands of prosperity, and the have-nots are paying the price for that. We see the same with COVID. COVID is a health issue for many people, which we might think an S, but again, disproportionately, the poor pay a much higher price of that. So these things are all related. In the beauty of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's not just that we can compartmentalize the E, the S, or the G, and I think that is very important. What people now have understood, that health risk is a systemic risk. The financial market is already starting to internalize that with companies. They're starting to assess companies based on that. And now that we are used to putting a value on that systemic risk with health, which will also very quickly go into the other areas. Now, the value chain is very important. We've seen here with COVID an enormous disruption in the value chains. And not surprisingly, companies that seem to weather this incredible challenge better than others are ones that have good relationships with their suppliers, and good relationships with their partners in a value chain. But I've always felt that to be a very important thing. When you have a value chain, like when I was running Unilever, I don't want to have child labor. I don't want to have slave labor. I don't want to have people that don't have at least living wages in their value chain. There's something about the basic principle of treating people the way you want to be treated, which we call the golden rule. So there are some standards there. And people say always, yeah, but it's competitive pressure. I can't stay alive. That's frankly a load of baloney. If you take care of your employees and you get higher engagement, higher loyalty, higher productivity, it pays out for people that are able to see these things holistically. Unilever never suffered during the 10 years. In fact, it had very healthy shareholder returns, despite taking care of that. So we have an obligation to pay our suppliers in time, as you say. We have an obligation to provide training and development. Alan Jope, I was very happy to see he went out, got 500 million in the market, more than many governments, and certainly most companies, and used the 500 million to provide credit to their suppliers. And they come out much stronger as a result of that. So you do have these obligations. And when you see that you have some industries and some businesses that are run by private individuals that have amassed billions, but then not willing to put a few $100 million there to protect the workforce in a value chain, you really have to ask yourself, have we learned a lesson of this? This is we need to run away from running our lives and trying to get everything on a spreadsheet with numbers and shareholders and shareholder return and narrow definitions of GDP. We need to bring humanity back to what we do and create this solidarity with all of us to ensure that we have growth and systems that are more inclusive and more sustainable.
Right.
There is no alternative.
Are there any particular sectors that worry you, particularly in that respect? I mean, obviously, the fossil fuel sector has been a target of a lot of environmental activists and ESG activists recently. Right. We have a huge interview with Bernard Looney, the CEO of BP, up on More Money right now, where he's clearly responding to that kind of pressure in a way that would be absolutely unthinkable 10 years ago. Are there other sectors, though, you think we're missing, Paul?
Well, even during this crisis, we have the shareholder meetings going on, and 66% of the shareholder proposals coming from the investors are actually dealing with the environmental, which is still mainly climate, and social issues. Things are changing out there. And we've seen major oil companies like Shell, BP, Total, and many others making commitments. Often it's still in scope 1 and scope 2 and not in the more difficult scope 3, but they're starting to move. And they're starting to move because they're responding to needs of society. We know that companies that want to be around for the long term need to be companies that make a positive impact, and respond to the needs of the citizens or consumers out there. And that, I think, movement is starting to happen. Unfortunately, companies cannot do it alone. There is so much you can do alone, a little bit more if you work collectively with an industry, but you also need governments. You need the rules, laws, and regulations. And here, once more, we are dealing right now with some of the major governments in the world that don't see that as their immediate priority. They look at it in silos, they look at it in short-term political cycles, and that would be a tragedy if that plays out that way. So increasingly, I'm happy to see a lot of the business community speaking up to ensure that that enormous amount of money that is being spent is spent well, that it's spent to create a future that we can all live in. Now, there are some industries that have learned a lot of things. In terms of handling the COVID crisis and the S, as you call it, there is actually no mercy for mistakes. You can make a donation of 10 million here, you can provide some masks, but if you lay off your employees by Zoom, or if you don't take care of your suppliers and pay for orders you've taken, you fall flat on your nose. And we've seen the financial market, and we've seen actually consumers punishing these companies. Reputation comes on foot and leaves on horseback. And in this crisis, as Edelman points out, we have seen companies build enormous reputation. Pharmaceutical companies would be an example of that. But we've also seen industries falling off the cliff very quickly. And that's a shame, because this is the moment of truth where you can really see if the COVID crisis, if a company is real, if their values are real, and if they truly subscribe to a multi-stakeholder model. So you'll see these winners and losers being shaken out in the next few months, I think, at a faster pace than what we've seen before.
Right. Chris, I'm curious, do you think that we need to think about global governance a bit more, given that, as Paul says, it's not just the case that companies can do it all by themselves?
I have to say you've got me on my hobby horse, but the crisis in capitalism is a crisis in governance, effectively. You've got 71 of the top 100 economies in the world are now businesses. You have many businesses, of those businesses are much larger than many countries. And they are effectively parastatal organizations. The decisions they make, a company like Unilever impacts millions of people's and millions of livelihoods. So they have as Paul says, both a moral responsibility and a social responsibility that exceeds sort of the traditional norm of what we expect from business. I think Larry Fink from BlackRock framed it very well a few years ago when he wrote to companies and said, basically, we have to accept the fact governments can't do it anymore, can't do it all anymore. We need business to step up, to have a social purpose. And we have to understand that large firms are now social institutions as much as they are economic institutions. They're part of the political fabric. And in terms of global governance, the crisis we're going to face in global governance now, globalization actually has net benefit to humanity has been enormous. It's as a result of globalization, hundreds of millions have come out of poverty that otherwise would be living in poverty. It also exacerbated income inequality in developed countries, which has led to the sort of political issue and populisms that we face now. But as we go forward post-COVID, we can expect to see that companies are going to turn inwards, as we discussed earlier. They're going to put up tariff barriers. They're going to try to be defensive. And the reality is we're going to lose the benefits of globalization, which really in the end is going to continue to be driven by globalization. The economic forces are going to continue to push for economic integration, and it's the benefit of everybody to have economic integration. But the champions, right, the new post-Bretton Woods institutions, the institutions that are going to have to play a leadership role there are going to have to be large firms. They're going to have to take collaborative action to help create standards for global governance, for treatment of labor, environmental practices. And we've seen this with the Paris Accord. We've seen this with companies starting to set up to the SDGs. But we need a lot more collective, collaborative action among the business leadership, which organizations like Paul's Imagine Group are championing. But so
essentially what you're saying is it's not just about, national heads of governments anymore. It's about CEOs trying to work across borders to try and raise standards.
Working alongside and with governments is the sort of phrase you would use. And if you look at the sort of Edelman poll again, 70% of people want that to happen. There's a very strong support for the public. They want business to act on its own, CEOs to take leadership on their own, and they also want to see companies working directly with government around these systemic issues. And again, the COVID crisis has brought these systemic issues to the forefront. And it's a really useful opportunity now to get companies to sort of pivot from just COVID to the other systemic challenges we face, like inequality, like the environment. So,
right.
Opportunity for leadership here.
So Allison, a company like Hansen Young, which is not in the business necessarily, or maybe you have been, but I didn't know, but not traditionally viewed as a sort of, global lobbyist for change. Are you interested in, getting together with your other counterparts in, business world to try and raise standards across the world?
Gillian, it's interesting. We have been lobbying very, very hard and working with big businesses like Unilever, like BlackRock, to really put together the long-term value framework against which companies should be reporting how they are showing up in the sort of way in which they're conducting business. And that long-term value framework includes, society, it includes how they treated people. It also includes how we're treating consumers, customers, throughout the world. So we have been working very, very hard to really put together this long-term value framework and corralling through the work that we can do, which is act as the connector, the collaborator, the sort of bringing together of all these organizations in an independent way, to actually put together the framework. And we're working very, very closely with the World Economic Forum now, as our counterparts with the other big four. They're really to put together the measures that we can start reporting again. So I agree with I think big business needs to now really stand up and step forward to really put together a set of reporting and transparency of reporting against a framework that creates long-term value for the world. So we care very, very deeply about this. It's something that we ourselves adopt. We are reporting very, very widely on all the things that we should be doing as a business. And I really like the phrase that Chris used, which is businesses are now societal, not just economic, and that is something that is very dear to our heart.
That's fascinating. I'm going to turn to your question in just a couple of minutes, because I know we have a lot of people watching around the world. Many of you may have something about this, so do send over your question.
Sorry, Gillian, I'm losing you anyway.
Yeah, I'm losing you too.
I'm sorry. Let me quickly try and come back. Can you hear me now?
No, it has a terrible echo.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to ask Hansi how you see this as I come off and then come back again. You hear that, Hansi?
Okay, I can't hear it, but I'm going to assume you asked me to sort of tackle the same question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. I think one of my key frustrations in working with business is I've seen exemplary leadership by the CEOs, and then I see their lobbyists do the same old, and go in with their hand out for getting as much as they can for the business and not supporting the overall sustainability agenda of the company. I also don't see companies banding together to, for example, advocate for a higher minimum wage, right? You see companies opposing that, who at the CEO level are saying, yes, we support all these things that are great, ESG, yay, and then not standing up for the worker. So I think there's a number of areas where we could see joint lobbying efforts when we're looking at the worker side of things. The higher minimum wage, portable benefits is something that, given that we have so many gig workers, we need to figure that out. And this is clearly a crisis during coronavirus. We need to have us explore ways in which companies can lobby to get subsidies moved away from things that are negative in terms of climate change and incentives that support investments to a low carbon transition economy. I mean, we see a very mixed bag there. There's an organization called the American Sustainable Business Council, which lobbies on sustainability, and they're doing a terrific job, but they don't have the big companies coming in there to support them, right? So I think that this is a real disconnect. The lobbying that companies who are espousing and actually acting in many ways from with good sustainability credentials are not then translating that into an active really leading agenda either in the US or elsewhere, and often more reacting, as we saw in this country with some companies on the automotive side, supporting the reduction of fuel economy standards, and others actually saying, no, we're going to stick with the better fuel economy standards. We should have really joint action, pushing governments to continue to support a carbon transition for climate change, as an example.
Right. Can you hear me now, Tansy?
Yes, now you're fine.
Fantastic. Can I just ask the magic wizards behind the scenes who are making the tech work to put me back into the system so that I can see, hopefully, the questions coming up. And while we're waiting for the questions, I just wanted to also ask quickly, Tansy, your story is fascinating because you started life, as I say, as an activist working with the Rainforest Alliance. You're now working in a business school. When you look at what's happening, do you not sometimes still feel tempted to feel a bit cynical and think this is an awful lot of, corporate spin and PR, greenwashing, woke washing, sustainability washing, whatever phrase you want to use?
I in running the Rainforest Alliance and sort of fighting for a better world and doing the same thing, working with students at the Center for Sustainable Business, I always have to approach life with a glass half full. Otherwise, I wouldn't get up in the morning. So I do get cynical sometimes about companies stating far more than they're doing, right? But those companies are soon caught out as being inauthentic, as soon have risk events that create challenges for them. I do believe that there is a massive shift happening. It's happening at the younger generation level. I see it in my students, but I also see it in the CEOs who are now in their 40s and who have grown up with some of these issues, see the impacts on their business. So I believe that while we're seeing less leadership from government than we need, and we certainly need more on the corporate side, that the shift is positive. And that people ultimately, they want to go home to their kids and be able to say, hey, I made the world better today, not, I fired 100,000 workers today, right? So this is what I hope that we will continue to see more, as this real evolution of business leadership.
Right. Now, if I can ask the magic wizards from the FT to set up the questions. Fantastic. Right. Okay, so we have some fantastic questions here. Is it time for green auditing standards to be developed and green environmental social reporting to become an annex to the annual report? That's a great question because most companies are scrambling to work out what's going to be happening next, but we are coming into AGM season. Who would like to pick that up? Maybe we should ask the accountants. Allison.
It's a good question for us, Gillian. Yes, we would like to see more reporting on this matter in the annual audits. We think there is real scope and opportunity to really broaden from being a pure financial audit into a much broader audit. And I think that would really tie into the sort of creation of long-term value for organisations. So the answer is yes, a resounding yes, it would be very valuable.
Right. And I have to ask a quick question, which is slightly inside baseball for ESG enthusiasts, but incredibly important. GRI or SASB or a combination of them both?
I'll give you some insight into that. I mean, the big three are battling it out, but I think where we're going to settle on is going to be, certainly for the financial markets, is going to be SASB, some combination of SASB and TCFD.
Right. Sorry, I forgot TCFD. It's acronym, it's alphabet soup in the ESG world these days.
That's right.
Yes.
But I think the bigger question on reporting, and George Serafim at Harvard, who's probably the world's expert on measurement in this space, is working on an interesting project on impact measurement. Because in the end, just measuring outputs and things that we've done and best practices doesn't tell us what the impact is. And what we need to do is to get to an impact measurement framework so companies can really understand what the impact they're having on their capitals. And they have to, as Tansy mentioned earlier, have to stop treating labor as though it was a commodity and sticking it on the P&L. And as a capital, it needs to be stewarded. It's the same way environment needs to be stewarded, the same way the communities need to be stewarded. So it's completely reframing the way business thinks about the key inputs it needs to do business and seeing them as resources it has to steward, not a commodity that government provides in exchange for taxes.
Right.
So it's a fundamental shift in mindset shift in business leadership. And some people like Paul obviously have made that transition, but many more need to get on board.
Any of the other you got views about TCFD versus GRI versus Southbeat? I'm sure that half of the people watching are going, why on earth do we have this alphabet soup in the sustainability world? But
absolutely, Gillian. The key thing is when people start to realize that we need to measure things that really count, there are many efforts that are starting to come up. We don't even have one accounting system globally for just the financial accounting. So the environmental and social accounting is incredibly complex, and it is quite normal that different groups come together. But the good thing now is that under the auspices of the WEF, the 4 big accounting firms and the others that have been mentioned are going together to come up with, hopefully, a standard that we can all use. You know, in about 50, 60 years ago, 85% of a value of a company could be explained by its fixed assets, and it was relatively easy for investors to make the right decision. That has now dropped to 15% to 20%. 80% is what we call intangibles, but these intangibles are very tangible. They're about your robustness of your supply chain, your culture, your exposure in terms of risks you're taking on health now or climate change. And increasingly, we're able to measure those. And companies that understand that, financial institutions that understand that and internalize that seem to be doing better. That's the whole essence of ESG investing. So yes, we do need these standards. You treasure what you measure. But we also need to change the definition of GDP. There are now some countries that are moving away from GDP because GDP was designed as industrial output on a very narrow basis, just like financial capital. In fact, it was designed by an American, Simon Kuznets, at the time of the Second World War. And he said, you know, don't use this as your measure of wealth, because it doesn't measure negative externalities, it doesn't measure positive externalities, it doesn't talk about income inequalities, and it doesn't talk about the depletion of resources. So that standard is just one measure. But we've become so enamored with it that we started to run the world that way. And that's coming home. That's coming home now.
Great example of the law of unintended consequences. Let's have another question, please. Fantastic. Great question here. Should there be conditions attached when governments subsidize large firms, for example, which would force them to achieve government's environmental objectives? Should bailouts come with strings attached? Who would like to jump into that? And let's not all talk just about the airline industry, although we can talk about the airline industry. Dancy.
Yeah. Couple of thoughts. First of all, you know, while factories are not functioning or functioning at a very low level, is the perfect time to put in place energy retrofitting and water reduction technologies and all these things that actually will improve performance financially as well as environmentally. So I wish that governments would, as they're giving companies money, also tie it to environmental performance investments. I think also from the labor perspective, to give companies money without having any requirements around no share buybacks, you know, investing back into your workforce. I think we absolutely need to have money tied to this. I think the Europeans have been doing a better job of this than the Americans. You know, we've sort of given a lot of different pots of money all over the place without a lot of strings attached. And there has been much more thinking about this in Europe. And I think we need to look there for guidance.
Paul, would you agree that the Europeans are doing a better job?
Well, so what is going to happen now?
Speaking of the proud Dutchman.
The biggest problem we're going to face now is unemployment. If the disease attacked the elderly, but it's very clear that the downturn crucifies the young. In some countries, we're already seeing unemployment like the US, 14.5%, 33 million people, and that's just the official economy. If you really look at the real numbers behind that, we'll see unemployment levels in the low 20s, with youth unemployment even higher. So the bigger risk is that we need to have job creation, and there should be a premium on job creation. The money that governments now spend is actually tax money. It belongs to the citizens. So it should be spent on the things that make the most sense to create a better world coming out of this. It happens to be that green jobs are actually better jobs, provide a better environment, are better paying jobs, and actually are the jobs of the future. So you could argue more secure jobs. So spending money, as Tensi says, in retrofitting buildings, making bike paths or walking paths, greening your energy system, reforestation to combat climate change, a very cheap option, by the way, are things that actually employ a lot of people and create that security, because you're doing something that has a little bit more sticking power. A lot of the money that we spent once more in the previous financial crisis has really gone to waste and actually aggravated some of the things that we're now paying the price for. Europe understands that. Europe actually says we're not only going to use that money to accelerate the implementation of the Green Deal, but we're actually going to accelerate. This is a very important year for both the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change, because countries have to come in with higher commitments. And we're seeing about 100 countries doing that already, especially the smaller countries, because you can imagine the small island states are drowning. But we now also need to have the major countries step up with their responsibilities. Business is making that very clear, increasingly so. Their voices are being heard, but not at the speed that is needed. No question about it.
Right.
And in some countries, we might need an election to change that.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I just wanted to quickly end on a positive note, because heaven knows we've had so much gloom in the last few days and in the news stream in general. And just quickly ask you each in turn, is there one thing that gives you hope right now? Tansi.
Well, I'll go to what I'm seeing from my students. You know, I think that we have a generation that has been buffeted by, 9/11, by 2008 financial crisis, now by the coronavirus, who recognize and for whom climate change will be the defining issue of their generation. And what I see from them is, whilst they're certainly depressed, they also have a commitment to working in social enterprise, to changing the companies they're going to go work for, to investing their money in ESG investments. They're pushing their employers to do these things. They're wanting to work in a company that's value aligned with them. They want to purchase those products that are more sustainable. So I have hope that this generation will help lead us to that next phase that we need to move forward on the planet.
Chris, what about you?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First is that I see positive signs that we're stopping having this conversation about ESG and corporate responsibility and moving into a conversation about what does business success look like in the 21st century? What's the role of business in society? And that's the conversation we need to be having. We need to move out of this kind of reactive conversation about business not doing bad things to how does business become a social partner in driving the positive change. And that conversation is definitely starting to happen. The second thing is large institutional investors are stepping up to the plate as we would never have expected even 10 years ago. Large firms, like BlackRock, has obviously been on the lead on this, but they're ramping up their investment stewardship teams. They are, in effect, becoming proxy for good governance. The failure of government, given the failure of governments. If we think about why do we have ESG in the first place? If companies are behaving legally, certainly they should be okay. We have a failure of government to set policy. So this is another conversation, but it's been interesting to see the role of investors in this conversation.
Thank you. Paul, we've got and Allison, you've each got about 45 seconds to tell us what makes you hopeful.
I'm actually very hopeful. First of all, we've seen an incredible fast reaction and amazing work by many people to respond to this crisis. Not easy, and many of the businesses have gone beyond their call of duty. And secondly, I've seen the citizens of this world rally together. If you see the work of the healthcare workers or the truckers or the people in the gig economy keeping us going, it shows you that there is a humanity level that has been awakened in all of us. And if we can keep that going, I'm optimistic. It was Martin Luther King that said we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And that is what we have discovered. We can come out of this crisis. We've shown what collective behavior does to attack COVID. I also think that same collective behavior and that energy will help us tackle the other challenges that we've talked about.
Great. Well, Allison, we don't often look to accountants for wild inspiration and excitement and optimism, but give us a dose.
I'll give it a go. I think my optimism comes from all of that. I think it comes from the collaboration I'm seeing across industries to innovate, in the collaboration across communities to pull together. I'm seeing how the youth are driving change, and I'm also optimistic about how business leaders on the whole are responding to this crisis and holding firm to creating long-term value.
Well, thank you, Allison. Well, listen, it's been a fantastic conversation to all of you. For those of you who are watching who do want more, do look on our More Money platform and newsletter, where we give an update on what's happening twice a week. And in the meantime, on behalf of all of us, I just say very best of luck to all of you in trying to steer us towards a better world. And meanwhile, on a very different note, those of you who want to be looking at how the financial system could or should be improved should tune in to a conversation I'm going to have in 10 minutes' time with Sheila Bair, the former FDIC head, who'll be talking about what we learned from the last financial crisis, what we need to learn now, and what we should or could be doing to make finance a lot more resilient than it currently seems to be. So thanks to all of you who are watching, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.